Welcome. My name's Simon Turpin, and I'm the Executive Director and Speaker for Answers in Genesis UK Europe. And I'm speaking to you today from my home in England. This is because we're still in a time of lockdown due to the coronavirus. So I'm going to be speaking to you today on the subject of answering atheism. You know, we see in the Western world an increase in unbelief and a decline in Christianity. And I'm not so sure exactly what the statistics are in the United Kingdom, but I know at least here in the UK, we see unbelief on the rise and Christianity on the decline. For example, in this British social surveys attitudes test, they told us in 2019 that the proportion of the British population identifying themselves as Christian has fallen from just 2/3, 66%, to just over 1/3, 38%, since 1983. And so we see, at least in the United Kingdom, I'm sure it's happening in the United States as well, there's a decline in Christianity and an increase in unbelief. In fact, the survey goes on to say that overall, the proportion that had never believed in God increased from 13% in 1998 to 20% in 2008, and then 26% in 2018. And so you can see in the United Kingdom, there's an increase in people who identify themselves as unbelievers. And you know, when we think about this, this is obvious, because generations of people have been taken through an education system or have watched the media, which basically teaches Darwinian evolution as fact, millions of years as fact. Naturalism is taught in the science classroom. Naturalism is basically atheism. And so we can see at the end of that why generations of people today are saying they do not believe in God. This is why this issue is important, and why we need to be able to give a defense for the Christian faith in today's era of history. In fact, we're going to do that by looking at atheism in a number of ways today. We're going to look at the Bible and atheism. What does the revelation of God tell us about unbelief? And this is important because as Christians, the Bible is the foundation of all of our thinking. Then we'll ask the question, what is atheism? And then we'll look at, is atheism a religion? You know, many atheists will tell you today that atheists are not religious. It's you Christians that are religious. And then we're going to look at science and atheism, morality and atheism, and reason and atheism, because atheists like to pride themselves on the fact that they have reasons to be atheists. They are reasonable people, and they are the ones that are doing science. And science, of course, in our era of history is equated with Darwinian evolution. But let's begin by looking at the Bible and atheism. Again, I'll repeat this, the Bible is our foundation in all of our thinking, and it's relevant here when it comes to the issue of atheism, because, you know, lots of people, lots of Christians today will talk about their unbelieving friends. And I think we need to drop that terminology. Why? Because the Bible tells us that all people everywhere have a belief system. Think about this text in Romans 1:18-20. It tells us, Paul, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, tells us, for the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they were without excuse. If you think about what Paul is telling us here, he's saying that ever since the creation of the world, God has revealed himself in such a way that if people who do not believe in him are without excuse. And so Paul is telling us here about the knowledge of the atheist. The atheist has a knowledge of God. Why? Because God has made himself plain through his revelation in creation. Well, you might say, well, if the atheist has a knowledge of God, why are they atheists? Well, Paul tells us they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. You know, people deny God in many ways. Atheism is just one of them. People suppress the truth in all various ways. And again, atheism is just one of those ways. You know, there are many religions in the world, but there's only really two religions when we think about it. There's God's revelation, and then there's everything else, which the Bible identifies as idolatry. And atheism, at the end of the day, is idol worship. It's the idol worship of self. And Paul tells us here that the atheist has a knowledge of God. And so that's important for us as Christians to think about, because when your friend tells you that, oh, they don't have any beliefs or they're not religious, you need to tell them, actually, God tells us that he's revealed himself in such a way that if you don't believe in him, you are without excuse. In fact, that word for excuse in the Greek is the word anapologetus, which is the word from which we get apologetics. So people who deny God's existence and die will have to stand before God in judgment, and they will be without an apologetic before God, because God has made himself known in such a way that people are without excuse. So let's think about what is atheism. What is atheism? Well, if you look at the dictionary definition of atheism, it will just tell you this. It's disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. Now, many of your atheistic friends might tell you that's what their atheism about. It's just a lack of belief in the existence of God. Well, atheism isn't just a lack of belief in the existence of God, because when the famous atheist Richard Dawkins wrote his book, the famous book, The God Delusion, he wasn't just setting out in that book a lack of belief in the existence of God. He was telling you what he believed as an atheist and wanting to convince other people of that. And so he was given actually an apologetic for his atheism. So atheism is not just a lack of belief in the existence of God. In fact, we would say atheism is a worldview which is adamant about God not existent. If you meet many atheists today, they are adamant about God's lack of existence, his not existing. In fact, we need to clarify something. There are different kinds of atheists. There are people who may be just soft atheists. Then there are what we call hard atheists, people who take their atheism very seriously. And then we're what we call misotheists, people that actually hate God, people like Richard Dawkins, who you see through the media spew their hatred for God. So we need to recognize there are different kinds of atheists out there: soft atheists, hard atheists, misotheists. For example, your atheist neighbor might be a soft atheist that might, just want to keep what they believe to themselves and not tell anyone. And they just want to disbelieve in God. But you also might have a neighbor who's very adamant about God not existent. But we would say atheism at the end of the day is a worldview which is adamant about God not existing. But what does atheism really, what do atheists really believe? What is atheism all about? Well, if you've ever read the book, The Atheist Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg, he sets out at the beginning of his book where he's going to take you along. So he sets out a number of things he's going to discuss about his atheism at the beginning of the book. And this is really interesting because he lays out at the beginning of his book his atheistic worldview. So let's take a look at what he tells us about atheism. He tells us, is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Well, think about that. How does he know that as an atheist? What do you have to believe in for prayer to work? God. So how does he know prayer doesn't work? Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. As an atheist, Rosenberg would say, as many other atheists would say, there's no such thing as free will. Why? Because what's going on up here is just physics and chemistry. So there's no free thought to your actions. There's no free will for an atheist. He goes on, what happens to us when we die? Everything pretty much goes on as before, except does. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. In fact, in his book, Rosenberg tries to argue for what he calls nice nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophy that life is meaningless, it's purposeless. But he would try and argue that evolution has programmed us to be nice to people. So he tries to give this argument for nice nihilism, which at the end of the day is just purposeless anyway. But he tries to argue for this view of nice nihilism. And then he says this: does history have any meaning or purpose? He says it's full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing. It's full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing. Well, think about it. Why even take the time to write a book if history is full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing. Why even bother to write a book and tell everyone about what you believe if there's no purpose and meaning of life, and if history is just sound and fury, but signifies nothing? But I think Rosenberg is good here to take account of, because he tells us what atheism is all about. And for me, that is a depressing worldview. It might be what atheists believe, but that is a depressing worldview. But he actually lays out quite succinctly what atheism really is all about. There's no morality, there's no meaning to life, there's no purpose in history, there's no freedom to thought because we're just chemical accidents. This is what atheism is all about. In fact, many atheists might not think through that worldview succinctly, but Rosenberg has laid out for us in his book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, what in fact atheism is all about. In fact, Rosenberg basically argues for a position known as scientism. Now we'll get to that a bit later when we look at science and atheism, but basically that's the idea that science is the means by which only any sort of real knowledge can be known. And that's what he argues for in his book, which is really a self-defeating argument. But that's the atheistic worldview according to Alex Rosenberg. Is atheism a religion? Now, I wrote an article on the Answers in Genesis website a few months back, Is Atheism a Religion? So you can go to the website and have a look at that. And it's based upon the points that I'm going to show you now. And many atheists didn't like it because they didn't like to be accused of being religious. But again, if from a Christian point of view, from what we just read in Romans 1, then all people are religious, including atheists. But you know what? This religious worldview of atheism actually shows up in atheism's belief itself, in the atheist life itself. You know, if you just look at the dictionary definition of religion, it tells us the belief in and worship of a superhuman control and power, especially a personal god or gods. Now, if you define atheism as a religion that way, well, of course, atheism isn't a religion, because they don't believe in a personal God, and they don't believe in other gods. So if you use that definition to define atheism as a religion, well, of course, atheism isn't a religion. But actually, the dictionary goes on to tell us religion is a particular system of faith and worship, or a pursuit of interest followed with great devotion. Now, if you define atheism a religion that way, well, I think then atheism is a religion, because it is a system of faith, and people do follow it with great interest and with great devotion. If you look at many Richard Dawkins followers or other atheists today on YouTube or something, then they have many followers who are greatly devoted to them. And so if you define atheism as a religion this way, then yeah, atheism is a religion. In fact, there's a famous social anthropologist named Ninian Spart who wrote a book, The Dimensions of Sacred. And in that book, he wrote out 7 criteria for detecting a religion. And you can see there on the screen, he talks about a narrative, experiential aspect, a social aspect, a doctrinal aspect, an ethical aspect, a ritual aspect, a material aspect. He says if you want to know if someone or some group of people are religious, then you can see these things in them. If you spot those things in them, any one of those 7 criteria, then basically, then that person or people are religious. Now, he does say not all religious groups have each and every one of these things, but when you look at a group of people, if you can see these things in them or a person, then they basically are religious. Now, if you look at those criteria and then you look at atheism, you can see each of those things in atheism. For example, what's the narrative of atheism? Well, it's Darwinian evolution. Richard Dawkins has famously said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So atheism's framework is Darwinian evolution, just as the narrative of Christianity is creation, fall, and redemption. The narrative of atheism is Darwinian evolution. So atheists do have a narrative. They have a narrative by which they live their lives by, and that's the Darwinian view of life. In fact, points 2, 3, and 6, the experiential, the social aspect, and ritual aspect can be seen in many ways. But one interesting way is when atheists opened up the first atheist church a number of years ago. In fact, there was an article in an English newspaper called The Telegraph, which spoke with the leaders of the atheist church in London, and it said this: the first event took place in a deconsecrated chapel in London in July last year. That was in 2013. Some 300 people attended the launch. A typical Sunday assembly consists of a sing-along, pop songs rather than hymns, a secular reading, a talk that helps the congregation live better, help often, or wonder more, the company's mantra, followed by a moment of reflection, then tea and cake. And of course, if you're English, you'll understand that's important to be in English. Tea and cake, you have to follow everything up with tea and cake. But think about it. Look at what the leader said. We try and live better, help often, and wonder more. Well, if you already have listened to me go through Alex Rosenberg's point, then live better than what? When you say live better than, it assumes a standard of right and wrong by which to live by. Help often or wonder more. What are you wondering more about? If history signifies nothing, if it's meaningless, if it's purposeless, what are you wondering about? See, the atheist worldview is inconsistent, but you do see the religious aspect in atheists when they do things like a religious service, when they meet together as atheists to sing, to gather together, to read poems, to talk about living better, helping people, and wonder more about the universe. This is a religious aspect to atheism. There's also a doctrinal aspect, which can be seen in the fact that a number of years, at least in this country, I'm not sure about the United States, the humanist organization teamed up with famous atheist Richard Dawkins, and they did an advertising campaign. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And you can see that those posters were plastered alongside those buses, all that went around different cities of the UK, London, Birmingham, Manchester, and they were pushing this message upon people. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and just enjoy your life. Because atheists have a message for people. They're evangelistic in their purpose. They want people to know about what they believe, and what they believe is that there's probably no God. But they were evangelistic about that. They do have a doctrine. They also have an ethical side. Famous atheist Daniel Dennett said this in a book back in 2006. He said, many declare there is a sacred and viable right of life. On the other hand, many of the same people declare that once born, the child loses its right not to be indoctrinated or brainwashed or otherwise psychologically abused by those parents. And what Dennett's talking about here is that if you Christians, if you religious people raise your children in the faith and you're talking to them about God, about heaven, about hell, that's abuse. That's psychological abuse on that child. And you should be thrown in jail. Well, again, that assumes a standard by which to make these judgments by, right? If you're going to have an ethical standard, you need to have an absolute foundation upon which to do that. But atheists deny that. Atheists do not believe in such things as absolute morality. In fact, atheism does not believe in morality, as Rosenberg has already talked about. There's no such thing as good or bad in an atheistic worldview. So why is Dennett accusing people, especially Christians or religious people, of psychological abuse? You can't do that in an atheistic system. See, you can't have your cake and eat it, but atheists often do. They want to push that religious worldview upon people. What about the material aspect? Well, I want you to listen to the famous American scientist that you have over there, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and on a TV program, Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey, he said something really interesting about the nature of the universe. I want you to listen to what he has to say.
Our ancestors worshipped the sun. They were far from foolish. It makes good sense to revere the sun and stars, because we were children. The silicon in the rocks, the oxygen in the air, carbon in our DNA, the iron in our skyscrapers, the silver in our jewelry, were all made in stars billions of years ago. our planet, our society, and we ourselves are stardust.
Well, apart from that's just nonsense, the fact that we are stardust, it's scientific nonsense. Did you hear what he said? He talked about the fact that our ancestors worship the sun. In fact, that was a good thing for them to do because we are their ancestors. So it's a good thing that they worshipped the sun because that's where we come from. And see, that's a worship of creation. You can see the material aspect of the religious belief of atheism in a number of ways, but especially in the deification of creation. In fact, in the same episode, Tyson went on to say, accepting our kinship of all life on earth is not only solid science, it's in my view also a soaring spiritual experience. You know, why is he, as an atheist, talking about a spiritual experience? Who are the people that are meant to have a spiritual experience? Isn't it religious people? So why is he, as an atheist, talking about a spiritual experience? Because of his inconsistency. He is a religious person and he wants to have a spiritual experience. He just doesn't want the God of creation involved in that religious experience. In fact, the main reason we know atheism or atheists are religious is because of what the Bible tells us. Because Paul goes on in the book of Romans in chapter 1, verses 24 to 25, he tells us, therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and they worship and serve the creature rather than the creator who is blessed forever. Amen. And so atheism really is an exchange about the truth of God for the lie, which is worshiping and serving creation. You know, you think about it, atheists have simply taken the truth about God's world and convinced themselves it's not true. They've simply taken the truth about God's world and convinced themselves it's not true. But think about this question, which is a question that a lot of atheists don't like, is what evidence would convince what evidence would convince atheists of God's existence? Now, I'm going to show you a clip of Richard Dawkins talking to a famous atheist in America called Peter Boghossian. And it's interesting to see their reasons for denying God's existence. I want you to listen to what they have to say.
That the host of arguments don't work. What would it take for you to believe in God?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus, or a great big, deep, booming bass, Paul Robeson voice, saying, "I am God and I created." But I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, which is orphans.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something. I mean, he made the point that a supernatural explanation for anything is incoherent, that it just doesn't it doesn't add up to an explanation for anything.
About alternative explanations, that's why I'm not persuaded by either an internal state, certainly not a feeling state. So
Clarke's third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic being supernatural. If you were to fly a Boeing 747 back to the Middle Ages, you would be greeted as God. I mean, that would be, and similarly, an alien visitation, any aliens who could actually visit us would have to be so far beyond us in their technology that they probably could manipulate the stars to spell out words or geometric forms or something of that sort.
So that couldn't be enough. So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would, which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. Trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like.
So you see that it's interesting at the end, Dawkins said, well, as a scientist, if evidence is forthcoming, I should change my mind, but he can't think of what that evidence would be because he's already told you that he can explain that evidence away by saying, well, it could be an hallucination. That evidence you're trying to give me for the existence of God I could be hallucinating, or it could be aliens playing a trick on me. See, those are the ways atheists are trying to get out of these arguments. But think about it. Well, let's apply that to Richard Dawkins. Imagine you're in a conversation with Richard Dawkins and you say to Richard Dawkins, Richard, prove to me your existence. Now, he'd probably look at you and think you're crazy because he'd think it's obvious I exist. Well, no, Richard, because it could be aliens playing a trick on me, or it could be because I'm hallucinating. Again, it's a self-defeating argument. If he's going to use that for God's existence, well, why should I believe anything about anything? Why should I believe that about Richard Dawkins' existence? Because it could be aliens making me hallucinate, or aliens playing a trick on me. And it could be either of those things. See, it's an inconsistent worldview. He just does not want to deal with the reality of the evidence for the existence of God. In fact, he's often tried to explain evidence away. For example, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he talked about DNA when he said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of being designed. You know, we look at DNA and it's so complex in its coded system that it's obviously designed. But Richard Dawkins says, well, it only gives the appearance of being designed. Why does it only give the appearance of being designed? Because if it's been designed, then you have to ask the question, well, who designed DNA? Well, we would say as Christians that DNA is a great argument for in the beginning God created, because DNA carries complex coded information that can only be generated by intelligent sources, not by mindless processes. DNA carries complex coded information, and that information can only be generated by intelligent sources. And it's great evidence of in the beginning God created, which is why we really need to do an internal worldview critique of atheism. Because if atheism is atheists are just going to deny evidence, then we need to really take their worldview and do an internal critique of it. And so we'll do that now when we look at those three things, and beginning with science and atheism. But we need to first and foremost realize it's not science and atheism, it's atheism and evolution. Because when atheists talk about science, by and large, they're talking about evolution. But it's also not just science, it's scientism. You know, I told you a few moments ago that Alex Rosenberg in his book was setting out for what he was arguing for in the belief in scientism, which according to the Oxford Dictionary is the complete belief in scientific methods or in the truth of scientific knowledge. So basically scientism is the only, would argue is science is the only real sort of knowledge for anything. In other words, you can only argue from scientific knowledge as our basis for knowing anything. But this ends up denying meaningful thought altogether. If you think about it, if it were true, it would be impossible to believe it. If it were true, it would be impossible to believe it, because there would be no beliefs about anything, including scientism. So it's a self-defeating worldview. If it were true, it would be false, because it ends up denying meaningful thought altogether, because you cannot even test this claim. How would you test it? If science is the benchmark of all knowledge, how can you even test the claim scientifically? See, it's a self-defeating worldview. But that's what atheism really is. It's scientism. It's not science, because science presupposes really the existence of God. But can God be proven by science? Because often atheists will say, give me proof, give me scientific proof for God's existence. But think about it. Can God be proven by science? No, because science deals with the material world. Science deals with the present physical material world, which you observe through your five senses. So you can't prove God by science, because science deals with the material world, whereas the Bible tells us God is spirit who transcends both space and time. God is not material. We do not believe God is a material being. The Bible tells us God is spirit. So you can't test God through the scientific method. However, what we need to realize is that we cannot make sense of things such as science, morality, and reason unless God exists. We cannot make sense of those things unless God exists. Think about it. There are several things that the natural sciences can account for, but cannot account for, but are rational to accept, which again disproves this idea of science being the answer to all things, because there are several things that the natural sciences cannot account for, even if they are rational to accept. For example, logical truth. Logic cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic. Science presupposes logic. So if you try and prove science through logic, you'll be basically arguing in a circle. So you can't prove science by logic. In fact, the laws of logic are non-material. Atheists cannot account for the laws of logic. Only the Christian really can account for the laws of logic, because the laws of logic, the non-material, they are abstract and they are universal, which shows that this implies a transcendent universal mind. Only the Christian can really account for the laws of logic. What about metaphysical truth? Statements like heaven, beliefs about heaven and the spiritual world, metaphysical truth. You cannot prove those things by science. It's rational even to believe that the external world is real, but it cannot be proven by science. You cannot prove the world is real by science. It's rational to believe that, but you cannot prove it by science. That's why, as we'll see in a minute, science came out of a Western Christian worldview. It didn't come out of the East, which many people in the East believe that reality is an illusion, which is why science didn't come out of that worldview. It came out of a Christian worldview. But what about ethical truth? You know, statements like good or bad. You can't prove things like that by science. Ethics tells us what people ought to do. Ethics tells us what people ought to do. Science does not tell us what people ought to do. It tells us at best what people can, or what they can do. It doesn't tell us what they ought to do. You know, if I shot someone with a gun, science couldn't tell me that that was good or bad. It could just tell you the mess the bullet made when it hit that person, but it cannot tell you whether it's good or bad. What about aesthetical truth? Well, aesthetical truth, statements like of beauty, cannot be proven by science, because they're very subjective, right? If you see a sunset, you as a husband might say to your, as a wife might say to your husband, what a beautiful sunset. The husband might just say, well, don't really care. See, beauty is often very subjective, and so you can't prove those things through science. But I've been told by leading professors of design, such as Stuart Burgess, that some things are obviously just beautiful and have been designed that way. For example, the peacock's feather is so obvious it's been designed, and it shows that God is its creator. In fact, we know scientifically the peacock's feather is degrading over time, which is proof that it couldn't have evolved, because it should be getting better. It should be improving if it's evolved, but it's not. We know it's degrading over time, which is evidence that it's been created. But when you look at the peacock, it's obvious it's beautiful. That's its purpose. It serves no evolutionary purpose, but it has a created purpose by God. It's obviously beautiful and pleasing to the eye. I just mentioned that science came out of a Christian worldview. This is important to understand, because many children today, many young people are taught that science and the Bible, science and the Christian faith are opposite to each other. Well, this couldn't be further from the truth. For example, Rodney Stark, in his book For the Glory of God, How Monotheism Led to Reformation Science, Witch Hunts, and the End of Slavery, at the conclusion of his book, he basically argues this: it was not the wisdom of the East that gave rise to science, nor did Zen meditation turn people's hearts against slavery. Science was not the work of Western secularists or even deists. It was entirely the work of devout believers in an active, conscious creator God. And so Rodney Stark here recognizes that it was the Christian worldview that gave rise to science. Notice he tells us it wasn't Western secularists or even deists. Deists are people who believe God started the universe off and then has nothing more to do with it. But it wasn't the work of those people. It wasn't the work of secularists. Science did not come out of a secular worldview. It came out of a Christian worldview. In fact, you can see that many of the founding fathers of modern science were Bible-believing Christians. If you just look at that list on the screen, when it comes to physics, you think about Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, chemistry, Boyle, Dalton, Ramsey, biology, Ray, Linnaeus, Mendel, Pasteur, geology, Steno, Cuvier, Sedgwick, the list goes on. In fact, the great astronomer Johannes Kepler talked about science being thinking God's thoughts after him. Many of these branches of science were founded by Bible-believing Christians, and it was because of their belief in God and the way he created the world that they said that they could go out and do science. So science comes from a Christian worldview, not from a secular worldview. I've heard people say, well, that was before Darwin, and then Darwin changed everything. But if you look at the people that I've highlighted in yellow on the screen, Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, Mendel, Pasteur, Sedgwick, all were contemporary with Darwin or came after Darwin and disagreed with his theory of evolution. In fact, James Clerk Maxwell, one of the greatest scientists of all time, was around in Darwin's day and argued against Darwin's theory of evolution. But today, many people equate things like the Big Bang and the evolution of man with science. That's why so many people would try and identify themselves as atheists, because they try and say, well, the Big Bang and the evolution of man is part of science. But this is important for us to understand, because we need to differentiate between two types. We're going to look at that in a second, but two types of science, as we'll see in a minute. But here's the thing: even evolutionists talk about the fact that deep time is so necessary for these things to happen when it comes to the Big Bang and the evolution of man. Because George Wall, the famous evolutionist, back in the 50s said this: time is in fact the hero of the plot. Why? Because you need all that time to even postulate things like Darwinian evolution. And if you notice there at the end of the quote, he says, time itself performs the miracles. In fact, here he's talking about the origin of life, because he realizes that in order for life to exist, then from his worldview, you need lots of time. You need time to perform miracles. Again, why is he talking about miracles in an atheistic evolutionary worldview? See, it's inconsistent with his evolutionary beliefs, because isn't it Christians and religious people who are meant to believe in miracles? Yeah, it is. But yet he's talking here about miracles. But notice, if you can see there on the screen, the quote, he says, the time with which we have to deal with is of order of 2 billion years. That was the age of the earth in 1954. The age of the earth today is 4.5 billion years. So that tells you something about dating methods. It tells you they're based upon assumptions, falsifiable assumptions, because we know that things don't age that quickly, right? In 60 plus years, that the universe is aged basically 2.5 billion years old. You wouldn't want to age like that. But it's interesting, this quote from Wald. But time, basically, for the atheist, is the hero of the plot. It performs the miracles. Time, chance, and the laws of nature. But those don't perform those such things at all. But it's interesting that the atheist recognizes they need the miraculous for these things to happen. But this is what science is, according to the dictionary, because science basically is knowledge, and it's knowledge that comes from your five senses when you go out to investigate the world. That's what science is all about. It's about knowledge. It's about observing the world, being able to repeat those observations, and then being able to test those observations. That's what science is about. But secularists today have tried to change what science is about. In fact, like I said, there's two ways of doing science which is important to know about. There's what we call experimental or observational science, which comes from your five senses, being able to test the world around you through experiment or observation. That helps you come up with technologies like laptops, mobile phones. You know, when you visit the doctors for medication, that comes through observational science. And we would say, yeah, great, observational science, we love it, because that's what came out of a Christian worldview, these different branches of science. It came from observing God's world. But then there's what we call origins or historical science, which is your belief about the past when you weren't there to see what went on. Now, it's important to realize both creation and evolution are both involve origins science. Both involve origin science. The difference being that, as Christians were saying, in the revelation of God, we have an eyewitness who has given us some of the information about what happened at the beginning. But think about when it comes to the history, the origin of the universe, who was there to see the Big Bang? Or who was there to see life evolve from non-living chemicals? No one was. See, that's origins or historical science. It's your belief about the past. And we need to understand the difference between those two things. In fact, we need to realize that both atheists and Christians have a worldview by which they interpret the world around them. For atheists, it's naturalism, the theory of naturalism, which is how they will interpret the world. And for Christians, we don't apologize for our belief that God's word is the foundation for our thinking. It's the way which we interpret the world around us. It's what governs our thinking in all areas of life, even when it comes to science. Let's look at atheism and morality, because atheists will often argue that, you know, it's not just you Christians that are being immoral, your God's immoral. And they'll often point to these passages in the Old Testament where God either destroys people at the time of the flood, or he wipes out the Canaanites in the Old Testament. But it's interesting, Richard Dawkins, that famous atheist who we looked at a bit earlier, said this in his book, River Out of Eden. He said, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." Well, if that's the case, how can Richard Dawkins or any atheist argue that anyone or even God is immoral if there's no good and there's no evil in the universe? And DNA just is, and we just dance to its music. How can Richard Dawkins then call people immoral or anything as being evil? Which is ironic, because a number of years after he had written this book, and in England, he had a television program called The Root of All Evil. That was in 2006. But in 1995, he says there's no evil and there's no good. But yet he wants to make a television program called The Root of All Evil. And in that program, he's basically looking at religions like Christianity and Islam, mainly Christianity, and saying it's evil. But how can he say that? He's just told us he doesn't believe that there's evil and good in the universe. See, this is the inconsistency of atheism. It cannot provide you with a foundation for morality. It cannot. In fact, many atheists want to charge Christianity with being immoral, but the bloodiest century of them all was the 20th century. And you can see there on the screen these famous leaders who were basically atheistic communists, who killed all these people. Stalin killed millions of people, as did Lenin, Pol Pot, and Mao Zedong. They killed millions of people. And well, people say, well, this has nothing to do with their atheism. Well, it is, because you cannot pull apart your actions from your worldview. Stalin's belief about the world led him to kill those millions of people, as did Lenin's, and as did Pol Pot's, and as did Mao Zedong. Their belief about the world, which is atheistic, led them to kill those millions of people. Now, thankfully, many atheists are not like that. but those people were killed due to their atheistic communism. In fact, when you think about the biggest killer of life today, abortion was legalized in the UK in 1968 and in America in 1973. And since that time, it's killed millions of children because of the belief in evolution and naturalism that's connected to those things. Because if we believed that God is the creator of life, then we wouldn't be killing millions of babies in their womb, because only God has the right to take life. In fact, here's a quote from an atheist called Joel Marks in his book, An Atheist Manifesto, which tells you something about his atheistic worldview. And in his book, he argues against soft atheism, which is people like Richard Dawkins, he would say, against what his view of the world is hard atheism. But he tells us this: the long and short of it is that I became convinced that atheism implies amorality. And since I'm an atheist, I must therefore embrace amorality. The religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality, but they are incorrect. I still believe about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality. And so you can see here, even a professor like Joel Marks, who's a professor of philosophy, basically argues that atheism implies amorality. And for atheists who want to try and be moral, he basically says you're a soft atheist. You're a soft atheist, where he would say he's a hard atheist. But he does tell us atheism implies amorality, which is what Alex Rosenberg pointed out at the beginning of this talk. What about reason and atheists? Because atheists will pride themselves on being rational, being reasonable people who love to reason and argue their points. Well, let's just think about reason, just really briefly and quickly, because which worldview can account for reason? Is it the Christian worldview or is it the atheistic worldview? Well, in the naturalistic worldview, reason came from non-reason and for no reason. Now just think about that. That might sound silly. Well, that's what atheists basically believe. Reason came from non-reason and for no reason. So atheists can't account even for reason. And yet we do it all the time. Evolution is survival directed, not truth directed. We need to realize that evolution is about the survival of the fittest. It's not about truth. In fact, a famous atheist psychologist, Steven Pinker, in a book wrote this: our brains were shaped for fitness, not for truth. Our brains were shaped for fitness, not for truth. So even from an evolutionary point of view, atheists cannot account for reason or even truth from that point of view, because their brains weren't made, weren't evolved for that reason. They were evolved for survival, not for truth. Why should an atheist evolutionist even trust their own reasoning faculties? This is something to think about if you're an atheist. Why should you, as an atheist or as an evolutionist, trust your reasoning faculties? Now, this isn't a Christian question. It's a Charles Darwin question, because Darwin asked this question in a response to someone. He said this: with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's minds, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? In other words, if our minds have evolved from purposeless random forces, then why would we even trust them? Why would we even? It's a good question. Even Darwin thought about this. Why would you even trust your mind or the conclusions you come to if your mind has just evolved? You think about it. If you went to buy a computer or a laptop from the shop, and the person who was selling it to you told you that it evolved, that it just came about through mindless processes, you wouldn't buy that computer because you wouldn't trust it. But yet many atheists want to use their minds, want to use their reason to try and argue against Christianity. Well, when they do that, all they're doing is showing that the arguments for Christianity and God's existence are true, because you need rationality to be able to argue convincingly, and you need God for rationality. You need God for reason. Evolution cannot explain reason and rationality. Here's another thing we need to look at when it comes to reason. We often think of faith. Now, atheists have a definition of faith, which they accuse Christians of having, which isn't even accurate. For example, I often hear atheists talk about faith as a belief that is not based upon evidence, or faith is pretending to know what you don't know. You know, that is not biblical faith. And if you think that as a Christian, that faith is not a belief based upon evidence, you need to rethink through your Christianity, because the Bible tells us that faith is based upon evidence. For example, the one thing that you need to know as a Christian is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the one thing you need to believe in. What is faith? Well, the most common word for faith is the Greek noun pistis, and believe is the Greek word pisteuo. Pistis refers to the state of believing based upon the reliability of the one trusted, trust, confidence. These are all lexical definitions, by the way. Pisteuo has to do with considering something to be true and therefore worthy of one's trust. And in classical Greek, before the writing of the New Testament, pistis refers to conviction, certainty, and proof. And so the words that the New Testament use for faith, or rather trust, refers to things like conviction, certainty, and proof. So our faith, our Christian faith, is based upon these things. Like I said, in order to be a Christian, you need to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, which is what Paul tells us in Romans 10:9. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You need to believe in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ in order to be a Christian. In fact, there's great evidence for the resurrection of Christ. In fact, you think about when Paul went to Athens and he proclaimed to those Greek philosophers, he gave them an argument for God and for the Christian worldview, and which led him to talk about the resurrection. But he starts off telling those Greek philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics, he starts off by defining who God is. God is the creator of all things. You know, the Epicureans were basically like today's materialists, because they believed that the gods were too irrelevant to be concerned with life, and so they didn't believe in the gods at all, really, because they didn't get involved with life, and so they were irrelevant to life. And the Stoics were basically pantheists, who believed that reason was the chief governing principle behind the world. So there's a lot in common with those people that Paul was arguing with the people that we see in the world today. But notice, Paul started off by talking to them about the God of creation. He was correcting their false worldview about the gods, which led him to talk about the resurrection. Because in Acts 17:31, he said this: because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given us assurance, and that's the Greek word pistis, to all by raising him from the dead. And so Paul starts off by defining God, who God is. He talks about their idolatry. He talks about the fact that God made from one man all people to dwell on the face of the earth, which leads him to talk about the resurrection of the dead, and that fact that God has given us assurance of this. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. Now, notice the reason why some of the people there on Mars Hill mocked Paul because of the resurrection, because that word for resurrection literally means that which was dead coming back to life again. And so that was foolishness in the minds of the Greek people. Why would a God die and come back to life again? Why would we want to die and come back to life again? Because in Greek thought, you wanted to leave the body, which is bad, and the soul, which is good, would depart. You didn't want to be reunited with your body. But they didn't mock because of the evidence. They mocked because of their world view. But here's the thing. It's important today that to recognize that even atheist scholars like this man, Gerd Ludemann, a German New Testament scholar, recognizes the fact of the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. He says this: Jesus's death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Well, I was talking about the resurrection, but in order for Jesus to be raised from the dead, he would have to have died. Now, there are people, not atheists, but Muslims reject the resurrection. Well, no doubt, Muslims reject the crucifixion of Jesus because of what the Quran teaches, but he's an atheist saying, actually, it's indisputable, the fact that Jesus died on the cross. The question is, did he rise from the dead? But there's great reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. You know, we believe as Christians, yes, Christ was crucified, but yes, he was indeed risen on the third day. And the empty tomb, the fact there's an empty tomb, is great evidence of the resurrection, because we know Jesus was alive after his death because of his post-resurrection appearances. And you can read about those in the Gospels, in Matthew, Luke and John. On numerous different occasions, Jesus appears to numerous different peoples over different periods of time. So there's great reason to believe the tomb was empty. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, we read an early tradition of that early church where Paul tells us this: for I delivered to you as first importance what I also received. So this is what Paul received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's the Apostle Peter, the 12, and then he appeared to 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. You need to remember, people like James were unbelievers. If you read John 7:5, James was an unbeliever. So Jesus appeared to these some of these people who are unbelieving. Paul, who was writing Corinthians before he obviously wrote that, he was an unbeliever before Christ appeared to him. But it's important that to recognize that James Dunn, who's not a conservative New Testament scholar, he says this tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, we can be entirely confident was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus's death. Some scholars say it was 2 or 3 years, but here Dunn tells us it was 2 or 3 months, that this tradition that Paul wrote about in Corinthians was circulating among the Christians, that Jesus had died and that he had risen again and that he had appeared to all these people. Now, here's the thing. Gerd Ludemann, again, he's an atheist New Testament scholar, said this in his book, What Really Happened to Jesus. He said, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciple had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So he's saying that is certain that Peter and the other disciples had experience of the risen Jesus after Jesus had risen again. But Ludemann obviously doesn't believe this because he's an atheist. He would say, well, they were either hallucinating or it was, you know, a guilt complex. But here's the thing about those two things. The disciples, the people who were following Jesus, didn't have any guilt complexes. You think about the Apostle Paul. What was Paul feeling guilty about when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus? He was out to kill Christians, to put them in prison. He didn't have a guilt complex when Jesus appeared to them. And as for hallucinations, well, individuals might hallucinate, but often, in fact, the reality is groups of people don't hallucinate. If you think about some of these military groups like the SAS in Britain, when they have these training weeks, you know, many people who go through these intense training weeks, some of the individuals might hallucinate because of the toughness of the program that they're on, but never do the groups of soldiers hallucinate as a whole. Hallucination happens maybe to individual, but not to groups of people. So a guilt complex theory and a hallucination theory just does not work. And so we can be sure that Peter and the other disciples experienced the risen Christ after he had risen from the dead. They experienced the risen Christ. They knew Christ. In fact, when you think about it, there's really only two reasons to deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. One, it's because of your naturalistic worldview, or two, it's because you just do not want to hear what the Lord Jesus has to say. Because in Mark's gospel, we read these words of the Lord Jesus: if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's sake will save it. And here's the problem for atheists. Atheism is all about self. And in order to become a Christian, the one thing you need to deny is yourself. You need to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow Christ. And people in the first century knew what that meant. They knew to take up your cross was to deny your life, because that would mean the march of death. But Jesus says, if you choose to save your life, ultimately you're going to lose it. But whoever gives his life up for his sake and the gospel's sake will save it. So if you're an atheist watching today, you may mock, you may scoff, but I hope you will take time to consider what's been said. We've only been able to briefly outline some of the problems with atheism, but I believe those problems are real for atheists. Atheists cannot account for science, they cannot account for morality, and they cannot account for reason. Only the Christian faith gives you reasons to believe in those things. In fact, again, the Bible says that God has revealed himself in such a way that if you do not believe, you are without excuse. So I hope this talk has been helpful for you if you've been listening. I just want to quickly mention some resources that may help you if you want to know more on the subject of atheism. There's a great debate that Ken Ham did with Bill Nye a number of years ago now called Uncensored Science. Bill Nye debates Ken Ham, and you'll see again, Ken puts the atheistic worldview on trial and does a real good job of challenging Bill Nye in his evolutionary thinking. And then there's two other DVDs that we have called The Bankruptcy of Atheism and Materialism and Naturalism. Those are, again, a great exposés of the bankruptcy of atheism and materialism and naturalism as worldviews. And then there's Jason Lyle's book, The Ultimate Proof of Creation. So it's one of the best books out there on apologetics from a creation point of view. He'll show you the futility of the unbelieving worldview, and that ultimately it's the Bible, it's the biblical worldview that makes sense of the world around us. And then we've got a pocket guide called Atheism. If you want to give this out to young people in your churches, I would really recommend this resource. And then finally, we have a series of books called World Religions and Cults, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And it's the third installment in that series that really deals with atheism and naturalistic worldview. So I want to thank you for listening and pray that you'll have a really blessed day.